Good morning. Today's webinar is titled Pharma and FHIR with Workflows and Decisions. I'm John Sverbley, and with me is...
Hi, I'm Denis Gagné. I'm CEO at PharmaTech, and I'll be doing the demos today with John.
If you have the next slide, please. To put things as a basic outline of the talk, we'll be first setting briefly a context about the pharmaceutical industry. Then Denny will be talking about BPM Plus Health and the standard software that they manage. I'll come back with talking about the example, which will be clinical trial enrollment. Denny will then come back with a demonstration of process automation, and at the end, we'll wrap it up with some questions and answers. Next slide, please. So to set context, we're talking about the pharmaceutical industry, and this is a global enterprise that is very large. Estimated total income will be 1.1 trillion for 2023, with just over half produced just in the United States. It's very complex with many processes and parts that have to move. And if any of the processes perform badly, you can have very serious side effects, either both expense for human suffering, but also financial. Next slide, please. And this slide shows some categories of processes that are in the pharmaceutical industry. This is not meant to be comprehensive, just a concept map that shows some of the processes that may be involved. So general major processes are clinical trials, conducting drug research, being concerned about patient safety, and then the actual operations of an industry. If we look under each of these, there are further subcategories, and under each of the final nodes, there might be hundreds or even thousands of nodes that basically get fired. If you look under clinical trials, they have three main process categories. The first is trial planning, where you look at trying to determine what statistical needs you have so that you can do it most efficiently. That also will determine how many people needed for recruitment. Then also you have to start planning in your trial what measurements that you'll be using and what outcomes you might be seeing. And for this, standardization is key, because when you're doing the planning, you want to have as few variables other than drug effect impact the results. So standardization, both in patients and in testing, is very important. Now, the performance of clinical trials is quite a bit different. And if we go under patient safety, one of the big concerns is the post-market reporting of adverse events. As opposed to a trial where you can control many of the factors that are occurring, in actual practice, the drugs may be given to population groups outside of your study group. It may be given to people with different conditions that would have been excluded from the original trial. And so sometimes adverse effects occur that are a big surprise. So one of the goals is to identify them early, try and find out how prevalent it is, then introduce a mitigating strategy. So that's something which has quite a few problems associated with it. If we go back to clinical trials, after you have the planning, you have to do the actual execution, which means that you have to recruit patients, and then you have to monitor how they perform over time, because sometimes the trial has to be changed from what you encounter. And then finally, after the trial is complete, you have to analyze it to see just what the effect was and what the adverse effects might be. Denny, do you have anything to say about these various processes, since you have knowledge of other industries?
Well, I just going to add that we're looking here at more of what the core business of pharma is and their processes. But naturally, there are a whole set of non-core processes that exist that are related to logistic and management and all kinds of different aspects of running a business that we're not tackling here, but that could also be part of the big large family of processes that exist within the pharma industries. But we're trying to be more focused on the core processes and more on the clinical side rather than the general financial, administrative, and marketing type of processes.
Okay, next slide, Denny, and it goes to you.
Okay. Well, thank you, John, for the intro and the context setting. Let me get into what we're trying to do from a technological point of view. We're looking at marrying two sets of standards from two different standard development organizations. On the one side, we have the healthcare standards, the HL7 organization that publishes a series of standards, including FHIR, and then some relationship to CDS Hook and Smart on FHIR. And on the other side, we have the more technology type of standards, where we're going to look at the standards from the object management group that publishes BPMN, CMMN, and DMN. And both these organizations can be reached at the URL at the bottom here. Now, some basic terminology, just to set the context on the object management group side, because that may be the side where people are less aware of. And the standards in particular that we're interested here are the standard that supports the notion of workflow automation and decision automation. And by workflow automation, we're talking about a set of technology or technology that allows us to orchestrate activities and also allow us to be able to react to different events that happens as we're doing this work. On the decision automation side, we're looking at technology that helps us make decisions, basically in the form of provided some input, what's the decision output that I produce. And these technology can be either supported with human in the loop or no human in the loop. So for example, we may have a person that interject, correct something, change a conclusion or whatever, or we can have it what we call straight through processing, where the whole thing is completely automated. That's a modeler's choice. It's a choice you make. And in the language that we're going to be tackling today, there's three of them that are of interest. There's DMN, the decision model and notation, which allow us to create decision using decision table and logical expression. There's the business process model and notation, which allow us to describe processes as a sequence of activities, but it's a prescriptive sequence of activities. We're saying what should happen next. Now, we also have branching in there and have different possibility, but we're also always dictating or prescribing what should be done next. And then finally, the CMMN, the case management model and notation, where in this context, what we're trying to do is react to events. So it's a much more declarative context where, given a particular context, whatever events happens, we react to it. And it's using what we call an event condition action semantic. So basically, your model is created of all these statements. On this particular event, if this condition is true, then do this particular action. Now, what's particular about all those three languages here is they're very visual. So we're basically drawing what we want to happen in all three cases. And these three languages can interact with one another. It's basically like your Microsoft Office suite, where you can have a Word document in which there's a PowerPoint slide or an Excel sheet. This is the same concept here. You can have a case that calls a process. You can have a process that calls a decision, etc., vice versa. And so you can do this mix and match as needed. Now, to just give you a little bit of a sense of these languages, let's look at BPMN. And in BPMN, symbols, all the symbols in all three languages, in fact, all the symbols have specific meaning and behavior. So whenever you see a circle, it means an event. So for example, a thin line circle here is a trigger, it's a start. Then the arrow tells me what to do next. Here I have a task. Once the task is completed, I do the next task. And as you can see here, these tasks can be of different type. It can be service task, predictive model task, clinical measure using CQL, or decision task with DMN. And then we have branching moment based on some condition. we could move to a case task, or we could move to a sub-process. The little plus here means that there's a lot more details under that activity that I'm not showing. And if I press the plus, it's going to explode this locally and show me everything. And then we have the notion of intermediate events. So that's events that can happen during the course of the process. And we have the end event, which basically tells you the different outcomes in which you can complete this process. So it gives you a quick overview of the three languages. And when we marry these three modeling languages with what we already have from HL7, then we get a value add pile or arrow here as depicted of different elements. So starting from the far left, where we want to take our data and aggregate the data from all the different sources, we then can add FHIR to that data. And with FHIR, we have common schema and medical resource, and that gives us actual computable data. So that gives us data automation. So with FHIR, we can achieve data automation, which is already very interesting. Now, if we add other standards like CDS Hook and Smart on FHIR, then we provide our data within a particular clinical context. So the Hook and the Smart gives us the context of the data. So that leads us to information automation. And then when we add the BPM Plus standards, BPMN, CMMN, and DMN, this provides us with task and activity, role and responsibility, decisioning, and then you can throw in some AI and machine learning and CQL in there. And then you have your workflow and decision automation capability, which leads to a higher level of intelligent healthcare automation, which is what we want to present and demonstrate today in the particular context of pharma. So I'll send it back to you, John.
Thanks, Denny. Okay, so we've shown the technology, and what we'd like to do now is drill a little deeper into the needs of pharma. And the example we'll use as a case use case is clinical trial enrollment. Next slide, please. When we look at clinical trials, they're a critical component of going from drug development to actual release and use in the general public. They can be very expensive to conduct. Next slide, please. And when you start off the clinical trial at the very top in the colored square, you can see that the clinical trial has a lot of needs, and it also has conditions that it's can affect it. And so you might need to be standardized, which you've already discussed briefly. You need a lot of different people, different expertise to work together in a coordinated fashion. And then there are changes that occur during the course of the study. And as you basically evolve, many of the needs and influencers affect cost. And with any business, what you want to do is reduce cost. You'll get the best product, but the lowest cost. So when you take the fact that you have an industry that requires standardization, in fact, embraces standardization, and has a need for cost control, both of those drive the decision to automate, where the hope is that you have something that's better, faster, cheaper than what you're currently doing. Next slide, please. And just to put our talk in relation to the initial diagram, we can see that we'll be talking about clinical trial, then trial enrollment, and specifically recruitment. Next slide, please. And there are different types of clinical trials based upon the phase of development and usage. What we'll focus on today is the phase 4 trial, where it's being tried out in a very large number of people, where the problem is to recruit suitable people as quickly as possible. Next slide, please. Excuse me. Okay, there are barriers to enrolling people in clinical trials. And if you look at the popular media, there's constantly a discussion of why this group or that group isn't included. And there are a number of factors that can feed into it. Enrollment requires several manual steps. While it is touted to be desirable, it's an optional activity for many physicians or practitioners who may be faced with many competing tasks. It's something that's not reimbursed, It's something where no one really is assigned, especially in modern healthcare, where you might have many providers taking care of a particular patient. Who's exactly is responsible? And then because of cost constraints and the impact of COVID on the workforce, there may not be anybody really available to assist practitioners in deriving it. And so in the end, it often is a situation where only motivated practitioners or very motivated patients will actually do it. So all these together combine to mean that a patient who might be eligible for a trial might not have it offered them just because of the reality. Now, Denny, you have a lot of exposure to other industries. Do you notice these same problems affecting other places where you work?
Well, it seems like discovery is a big challenge here. So, John, how does someone know what are the available trials, and how do I know if I'm fit for the trial? So, as a patient, I'm not a clinician myself, where you are, but as a patient, how do I know what could be available for me? And you, as a provider, how do you know what to recommend to me?
Well, there are several possibilities, and each depends upon the practice situation that you're in. If you're in certain specialties, such as oncology, where clinical trials are an integral part, usually it's a little bit easier to get the information out. The basic resource, there are several websites that promote, well, that record the different trials, but the patient first has to have the diagnosis. The physician needs to think about it. He or she then needs to go to the website. They need to search through, and the search is not really optimized for easy discovery. Often will have to look through quite a stack before you find one that matches the patient properly. And then you've got to, once you have selected one, which can take some time, you then have to wait to the next visit for the patient to actually see it. The barrier to the patient is often they're not aware of where to look. They have enough problems. They're often faced something that is a stressor to them. And again, it's only sometimes the people with greater resources who have the ability to actually start the investigation. And with any manual process in healthcare, there are many tasks that need to be done, and any one of them can become derailed under various conditions.
Yeah, so I can really understand that fundamentally there are a lot of barriers, and it's really hard. So do those trials get filled up with the needed people? Because it seems like it's a lack of information at some point. You know, the providers may not be aware of all the trial. The patient may do some research and say, hey, I'm aware of this trial that could be interesting for me. As we know, patients are more and more informed, either correctly or incorrectly by the web. But it does put some pressure into making all these parts fit together.
Right, and there's a lot of factors that make some parts of society or some groups in society more represented and others less represented. But a lot of it is the specialists tend to be most knowledgeable about trials. They have their meetings, they have discussions. So for a specialist, they often are aware of trials in their own specialty, but they will be totally unaware of trials in other specialties. And people in primary care may not, there'll be a lot of trials that they have no clue whatsoever. So the question comes up is, how can you make it a better process? And this is a textual narrative to describe how might you make it better. And so there's a series of steps that forms the process, and each task is numbered here. And so you would start off where as soon as some triggering event occurs, and that could be a new diagnosis or a new entry into a problem list, that triggers something automatically to say something of interest is here. The process that has been triggered then automatically goes through all the trials, looking only for those where people are being recruited. Then it can iterate through all the open studies that it's collected and decide, does this patient meet inclusion? And do they fail to have exclusionary criteria that might make them suitable for the study? And this is important when you get into the post marketing release, because sometimes this inclusion exclusion may not be as rigorously enforced. Once the set has been pruned a little bit by seeing what the patient might be eligible for, then the process can look at things like location, distance, insurance, and other factors that might make it a better match or not a good match for a patient. For example, a trial being recruited for California would not be the best match for someone in Virginia. And then when the final list is done, a message can be sent to the provider to say, here's a short list that's relevant to this patient. Then at the next meeting, the physician, with very little burden on him or her to actually search for it, has a short list. They can then sit down with the patient and then reach a decision then and there. It's not a perfect system, but it's one that I believe is better than what currently is being offered. To you, Denny.
Thank you. Thank you, John. That gives us a good sense of how we could maybe improve all this. So let me go into a little bit of a demonstration. We're going to be using the TriZetech platform, the BPM Plus standards, FHIR and CDS hook, and we're also going to deploy this on one of TriZetech partner, the Smile CDR FHIR server. So let me switch to the environment here. And so first of all, let me get to this process description that John just gave us of what could happen. And this is a version of it in BPMN where we can animate it to give us a sense of what will happen. So we have the global context. So when a patient new condition happens, then we go to the directory and the repository of all clinical trials that are listed. We look at the list of potential trials that match the new condition. Then for each one of them, we validate if the patient is a match for that particular trial. If it is, then we notify the provider that there's a potential map, and this provider can then review. And if he feels that this is appropriate, he may recommend it to the patient. Then the patient is informed and can review the details of the trial himself or herself. And then if they accept to jump on that trial, then the provider is advised and then can initiate the trial contact to put the trial in place. So as you can see here, it gives you a general sense of this automation. We're doing the big picture here. Now I'm going to move and I'm going to go into this particular area here of validating the match for some trial. So let me start with one particular trial here. It's an Apple Watch trial that is announced. And again, in BPMN here, I'm looking at what is the, if the indications are met by this patient. So I have the patient's information that I need, and there's a decision. And if it's not met, then he is not a candidate or she is not a candidate. If they are met, then we're going to check for contraindication for this particular trial. And again, the same thing. If there are contraindication, then he's not a candidate. If there's no contraindication, then the patient is a match. Now, the beauty of these model is I can go here and I can deploy this model. And when I published this model, it becomes a service. And now I have a full service that's executing this model. So if I go here, I have an HTML form that requires all the input for it. So now it's an actual service that I can execute. I also have a full REST API for it from a technology point of view. It's fully documented. I can exercise this REST API. And so now this model is now an actual service that I can consume. So if I go into my healthcare EHR, so this is the TriZetech Healthcare Sandbox to do our demonstration, where on the right I have my different patients, on the left I have my information panel, and here I can go and take, for example, my Apple Watch study, go into the CDS hook integration, copy that hook endpoint, add it to my EHR, add it to my EHR, and now it's running on that patient. So now every time I'm going to change patient here, it's going to run, and you see that Willie Craven is not accepted for the Apple Watch study. If I go to Pearl Hart, also not accepted. If I move to Madeline, she's accepted. She's meeting all the criteria. And then I can do this for multiple services. For example, we also have here a Crohn's disease example. So I can go take the CDS hook, add it here, put my endpoint in here. Naturally, this dropping the endpoints would be done by your IT group, but we're just showing you how simple it is. And as I'm moving from patient to patient, they're either accepted or not accepted. And you see that Marianne here is accepted for Crohn, but not accepted for Apple. And so we have another one for a COPD study, where I can get also the COPD study endpoint, add it here, and run it. So now I have a full set of COPD. Now you see not accepted for the acute heart failure of the Apple Watch, not accepted for the Crohn's disease, but accepted to the COPD study. So the essence of what we wanted to show here is how we can readily do this portion here of, depending on the condition of the patient, trigger automatically and validate what studies are available, validate if all the criteria are met, and whether there's some contraindication. And in that case, then we can advise. Here we were just displaying on the screen whether that was the case, but we could as well have done a message to the provider and say there's a match for this particular trial and carry on with the whole environment. So that's pretty much it for the quick demo that we wanted to do. I don't think we'll have time for Q&As, but I do invite you to enter your questions into the question panel, and we will try to reply to you. We want to be respectful of your time. If some people want to stick around and ask questions, we'll be happy to stick around and answer those questions. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, John, for this context setting and intro. Happy to answer any question online or offline as needed. Have a great day.
Thanks, Denny. And please let us know your questions. We love the feedback.